Hi, guys. I wanted to put in part two of what we've been talking about with Kingdom because I was going over it this morning and I got excited, and I think it's better to do it when you're excited. We talked quite a bit out of Hebrews chapter 10, and that's the whole passage where it shows Jesus sitting down at the right hand of the Father. There is an Old Testament story that I really think is just awesome, and it's found in First Kings, and it takes place when David is at the end of his life, and for all intent and purposes, he's kind of disappeared from the picture. He's still king, but he is obviously very close to leaving this earth. And the scripture kind of makes it sound like he's really out of it, which he could have been. He was only about 70, but of course he had a lot of mileage in those 70 years, probably more than most people would have gotten in 2 or 3 lifetimes. And so it's the very last days, and yet there's one problem, and that's that he has not openly declared an heir to the throne. And so there's some doubt. There was insider information because he had sworn to Bathsheba that Solomon would be the heir to the throne on that, but it had never been made publicly known. And he had another son at that time. That son's name was Adonijah. He was next in line after Absalom. Of course, Absalom was gone, and Adonijah was kind of, from an earthly point of view, he was the logical one to take over. He was charismatic. The Bible says he was handsome. It's pretty clear that he knew his way around court, and he knew the ways of powerful people, and was certainly not above of taking advantage of privilege and rank. And when he surveyed the scene, he came to the conclusion that he was the best candidate for the job. And so at some point I'm sure this thing was working a long time in him, but he started moving pieces on his personal chessboard to try to make this thing happen. He'd never been told no. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells us that David never corrected him. Might be part of the problem there, you think? So Adonijah generally felt like he had a pretty good shot at this thing. Solomon, who was obviously the other candidate, Solomon is never going to be backed by, let's call him the moral majority, because of the circumstances surrounding his birth and the scandal of it, and certainly anybody with any religion and morals would realize that Solomon is the son of adultery. God would not do something like that. That's for sure. So there's some powerful cards to be played, and Adonijah is busy stacking the deck the best he can. He has to, obviously, there's several steps into taking a throne, but we'll talk about those as we go along. But one is you've got to have a strong constituency. You've got to have strong support. And you need support from the right people. And typically, historically, that always has to do with the church and the military. In most government cases, if you don't have the support of the church and or the military, your chances become very slim. So the military, of course, doesn't mean every soldier, but it means the leadership. And the leader of the military at this time is a man named Joab. And what an interesting critter he was. He was actually David's cousin. And Joab is a guy who had been through all of David's wilderness experiences, harrowing ones. And he, if anybody knew David in the sense of his history and his reactions and so on, it was Joab. Now, he and David did not actually always get along very well, though you cannot cannot put a mark on Joab's loyalty to David, at least up until this point. I mean, the guy had been through a lot of stuff, living in caves and running from Saul and the craziness of all that. And he hung in there through all that. But the only problem was he really got bit by the lust for power and the lust for position, and it got him bad enough, it bit him badly enough that he ended up killing two competitors for the top position in the military. He killed Abner, and he killed, I think it was Amasa was the other one. And both of those were, although either of those were not David's favorite people, it was a great grief to David, the way it was done, and just the usurping of Joab. And it began to build this division between Joab and David. And that division was forever cauterized and sealed the day that Joab killed Absalom, especially after David had specifically asked him to be easy on the boy. And but Joab would have nothing of it. He knew that what this kid was all about, and he's the one who thrust him through. Well, that served to pretty much divide David from his cousin from then on. But David, there was not. You just don't throw somebody like Joab out of power. The man is very powerful. He has great followers. He has a whole hierarchy of people underneath him that support him, that depend upon him, that live and breathe his desires because it coincides with theirs. So even though David is king, the removal of Joab would have been very tricky. And so Adonijah spots this division, of course. It was no secret. And he capitalizes on it. And he's able to win Joab over to his side. And, you know, I'm sure people had an idea of what Solomon was like. He was not a man of war. He was not a soldier. He was not a charismatic leader. He was a poet, for goodness sake. And a man like Joab probably would feel a lot more comfortable in an administration that still savored a little bit of violent takeover and war and extending territories, manifest destiny, and so on. And instead of being in the administration of somebody like Solomon, who probably wants to host poetry conventions. So for Joab, Adonijah was the logical choice. And so the military is firmly behind Adonijah. And we're going someplace with this whole story, by the way. And it was pretty obvious that David, in his heart and in his private personal affairs, he had replaced Joab with a man named Benaiah. And Benaiah was one of his mighty men, and David obviously implicitly trusted him totally. And so he's not ignorant of that. He knows that he's been put on the shelf, but that only wise moves on his part is going to preserve him in his situation. So, and it's interesting in this time, David, you follow on about the people whom David leans on personally. And so many of them are foreign people. They're mercenaries. His bodyguard was composed mostly of mercenaries. And it's just kind of interesting. You say, okay, well, what kind of environment was it that David was in that he actually, his heart rested more in the trust and in the hands of foreign mercenaries than in the very Israelites themselves? It's kind of an interesting thing. Of course, David spent so much time outside of the boundaries of Israel, and won favor because of who he was, won favor, to the death kind of favor with great warriors and great people who admired him and were willing to give their lives for him. And so David preferred this kind of a bond over the bond that was dictated by protocol and bloodlines. And so it's not like a totally harmonious relationship that David had with his realm and all that he was over. In Judah, much more, but Israel, not as much. You'll remember Israel did not come under the fold until much, I think, 7 years later, after Judah recognized David as king. So there's some underlying currents that were moving here. They were human beings, and human stuff was happening. Another box to check, like we mentioned, is religion. You got to have the church, and there was two main religious leaders at this time, a man named Zadok and a man named Abiathar. And Abiathar, man, this dude's been with David. He joins him back there in 1 Samuel, I think it's like about 25 or somewhere like that, when David leaves the cave of Adullam for the first time, and he goes to help a little town called Keilah because the Philistines are stealing all their crops and everything. And David has compassion for them and takes his men and gives the Philistines a good blistering and sends them on their way. And at that time, the priest Abiathar joins him. He has to flee because he was part of that priesthood that was located in the town of Nob, which was, Saul had decided that all of them were traitors, and he put the whole mess of them to the edge of the sword, and it was a bloodbath. And Abiathar just escaped from that thing. He was the only one to make it out of there. And so he knows his name is going to be up on the post office wall as well. So he joins David, and he's in for the ride out in the wilderness and the hiding in caves and out of caves and in swamps and whatever. So he's another man who's been with David through the thick and the thin. However, at some point, and I don't think we're really told when and where this happens, this man named Zadok really begins to win David's heart as well. I think he felt in him the same spirit of worship. If you read in it's Ezekiel 44 or 45 in that area, where of extremely powerful prophetic insights that God gives us there, where he divides the whole priesthood into two groups, and the two groups are one under Abiathar and one under Zadok, one under it's the Levites, he just calls them the Levites, and another under Zadok. And he makes the distinction between those who would serve in the house and open the door, offer up offerings, put water in the laver, keep firewood going, and would be in the gaze and in the eyes of the people. They would always be in the eyes of the people would see them. They would be the visible representations of God to the people. And yet there was another priest, and in Ezekiel it's likened unto Zadok. And these would be those who, through their faithfulness, the kind of heart they had to serve the Lord and not serve the idea of pleasing the people, they were set aside to minister unto the Lord. Whereas the Levites ministered unto the house, these of Zadok ministered unto the Lord. And we're not told exactly why David began to lean upon Zadok more and less on Abiathar, but it's for sure that Abiathar felt it. And he esteemed that he had equal right to that place of being the priest, and he probably felt a little eased out by Zadok. And that's the only way you can see that possibly why this man at the last hour, after having been through everything that David went through, at the last hour would give himself to this Adonijah, this pretender to the throne, instead of waiting and waiting for the king to declare. There were some who probably felt he's too old. He's forgotten. He can't trust what he's going to say now. He's just not with it. He's out of it. He's not responsible. Well, obviously not everybody felt like that. I like this statement. It says, when once self-regard gets in, it is like a trickle of water in the cracks of a rock, which freezes in winter and splits the hardest stone. No common action for a great cause is possible without the suppression of sidelong looks toward private advantage. Woo! That is so powerful. That the truth of that has been illustrated countless times through history, not only the history of the church and the godly history, but the history of every kingdom that's gone on. So Adonijah, this young man, he's able to line up these guys behind him, and they're heavy hitters. There's no doubt about it, and Adonijah's, because he does not have a direct declaration from the king that he is chosen, but then nobody does. He's leaning heavily upon these heavy hitters. This is his best shot is with them. So as it works out, Nathan the prophet and there's this little situation that goes on where where Adonijah jumps the gun and starts celebrating the victory before there's actually been any real evidence that he is the victor. And the news of that gets back to those who are faithful to David, and they have the inside knowledge that David's heart has always been that Solomon should reign. And when they hear that Adonijah has made this move, especially Nathan the prophet, he knows, having a prophetic eye, he knows where this thing is going. And so he arranges a little situation using Bathsheba, because the cold hard facts were if Adonijah got in, he would probably kill Bathsheba and Solomon. That's the way you eliminate competition for good. And so he arranges this situation where both he and Bathsheba fall upon David in 2 blows, playing the innocence that they just heard that Adonijah was moving this and this whole plan, and hadn't David, knowing full well that hadn't David really decided that he wanted Solomon on the throne, and how could this be happening, and why didn't you tell me, and so on. And it does the trick, and the sleeping lion suddenly wakes up, and David is stirred one more time to action and moves lightning quick. Just imagine the old lion. He's about gone, but he's got enough in him to swing that paw really hard one more time at least. And he springs to action and commands Nathan to get Zadok the priest and Benaiah. And so he's got military, and he's got the priest, and he's got the prophetic too. And to get Solomon and put Solomon on David's mule, and ride him through Jerusalem, and ride him and take him up to the court and anoint him and proclaim him king and seat him on the throne. And so that gets set in motion, and probably the Lord entered in here, and it just spread like wildfire that this was happening and that Solomon was David's choice. And the whole city responds in such a way that the people who were celebrating Adonijah's victory hear all this commotion, and when it comes down and the knowledge spreads that Solomon has been chosen, suddenly all the guests get cold feet and they scatter like cockroaches in the light, leaving Adonijah by himself there. And the, it's interesting. The man who announces when he shows up at the party and Adonijah says, "What's all the noise in the city?" He tells everything that's going on, and he finalizes with this, "And Solomon has been seated upon the throne." And see, that's the action that seals the deal. You can have trumpets and mules and proclamations and celebrations and processions and crowns, but what really counts as the end is seating upon the throne. And as soon as that happens, it's over. There is beyond all doubt, there is now a king. And so when the messenger told all the guests that now Solomon was seated on that throne, that did it. So that's kind of the end of this whole sad episode. But all that, I like this illustration because there's we have lived, history has lived some of that in a much bigger and more important version in the seating of Jesus upon the throne. He came in. He had the promise, even the promise of David is what Jesus had, because God gave David that promise that there would always be from his line to sit on that throne, and Jesus came as the culmination of that promise. There's the faith, there's the tried and trusted friendships of the highest kind of intimacy that surpassed and stepped outside of the normal protocol. And so here comes King Jesus, and he's not picking up powerful Pharisees and Agrippa the king, and he's not looking for those to be his heavy hitters. He's picking out people like Peter. And we would say, who's he? What kind of hand can he lend to this? But God knows what he's doing. He knows who the real heavy hitters are. And talk about having the Nathan, the prophetic side. The New Testament is clear. It says, and all the prophets bear witness and testify that this is the Christ. All the prophets. So he didn't just have a prophet. He had the whole prophetic ministry on his weighing in on his behalf. And of course, he rode into Jerusalem on the mule, and he received an anointing from heaven, and it sealed the destiny beyond all opposition. And so Jesus came and he did all that, and of course then he was crucified, dead and buried, rose from the dead, and ascended, and to where? To sit upon the throne. And when he sits on the throne, the kingdom is established. So it says in Hebrews 10:13, it says he was sat down at the right hand of the Father. It says, waiting from that time onward until his enemies be made a footstool for his feet. Waiting. And I think we might have said this the other day, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it's something that needs to sink into us. That anytime we find ourselves in a situation where we have to, here's the man the Son of God who's gone through this incredible earthly journey and paid this incredible price that none of us could ever understand, and what he's gone through. And you would think he had the right to say, all right, I paid, I want the goods now. But that's not what he's doing. He's seated at the right hand of the Father, and it says, waiting. Not demanding, not proclaiming, waiting. So when we're able to do that, we honor the Holy Spirit, the angels, and the very plan of heaven. You declare his sacrifice is complete, is sufficient, and perpetual. Waiting is one of the most powerful things we can do, and it's one of the things we avoid most consistently. It's one of the things we cringe at it. The whole virus thing here is, it's got all of us grinding our teeth at the waiting that is we're having to go through here. Okay, but move on. It says he's waiting until his enemies be made a footstool for his feet. Do you remember when the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon? And she comes into that court, and she's leading quite an entourage and got camel loads of gifts and riches. And you can't help, as you read that, it's in 1 Kings 10, I believe, you read that, you can't help but think she was kind of, the stuff I've heard about this guy he cannot be that good. He's not the only monarch on the block, you know. And so she brings a little stuff to show off her stuff a little bit too, you know. I mean, just she may not be as big, but she's got some stuff too. And when she gets there, she is so knocked out it takes her breath away. And her statement is, I didn't believe what they said, and they didn't tell me the half. So overwhelmed. And one of the things she says in this, as she's blurting out of her unbelief and her disbelief of the greatness of this kingdom, and that she says, blessed are the men and the servants of yours who get to stand here every day and hear the wisdom that comes from you. You can almost hear in her voice like, I would give up a queenship to be one of those people. To be able to, I was so willing, call me a servant, call me a slave, call me whatever. I'll be the bottom rung, but it means I get to stand here close to this throne where I can hear firsthand the words that come from his mouth. I'll take it. That's how great it was. So, how great would it be to be the footstool of Jesus? You know, we pay big bucks for, back in history, we used to pay big bucks when there were these things called concerts and these things called sports stadiums and events. You paid the big bucks to get close up front to where you could see all the action and hear everything going on firsthand. Well, you couldn't get much closer than a footstool. That was the place of big bucks. And so he is waiting that until his enemies be made his footstool for his feet. And of course, the way Jesus conquers his enemies is different than the way there's not going to be a bunch of high-fiving and fist bumps, and no, he conquers them by loving them, by serving them, by gentleness. Thy gentleness has made me great, David said. He has a different kind of warfare that he does. And then it goes on in Hebrews 10:14, it says, for by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And I want to wrap this up here. Perfected. I'm just going to read this from a commentator. I think it's so hits the bullseye here. Perfected. What is perfected? According to the New Testament teaching, a man is perfected when he has all the capabilities and possibilities of progress and goodness and communion with God made into realities and facts in his life. When the bud has flowered and the flower has fruited, when capacity is developed, privileges enjoyed, duties attended to, relationships entered into and maintained, when these things have taken place, the man or woman is perfect. One thing the New Testament, and it's so easy to forget this, that this has to be a filter with which we read the New Testament and a filter with which we read life. There are levels of maturity in God's household, and things that apply at the level of babes and children do not apply on the next few steps up, and they certainly don't apply up at the top of the ladder there where the elders sit. And things that are up at the top there do not apply to those who are in your own life. There are situations that God put up with in your life for a long time, and maybe never even spoke of it. And yet there came a day when it's almost like he said, you know, at your age, do you think it's becoming that you should still behave like this? So there's growth and there's expectation that goes with growth, and we should never forget and be discerning of growth and be discerning of where people are. It says the man of wisdom discerns all, and yet no one discerns him. That's just the way it works. Sanctified. What does it mean to be sanctified? Sanctified, it's gotten really confused with a lot of do's and don'ts and a lifestyle of do's and don'ts, but that's not really what it is. Sanctified has much more to do with relationship. It's the establishing of a person because of relationship. I told this story often before, but when I worked in this carpenter furniture shop in Columbia many years ago, the owner of the shop, the man who ran the shop, took me in the first day, and I'm just a learner. I'm there to learn. Took me in, and there were 5 or 6 young men working in there, and it was a good sized place, and they all working on their workbenches, making different trunks and dressers and what have you, and there was tools scattered all over the place. These of course were all hand tools because we didn't have power tools then. Chisels and planes and hammers and you name it. And he said, so here's where all the young men work. This is where you'll be working. And then he said, come over here. And he took me over, and there was this big chest, like a stand-up wardrobe almost. It was that kind of a size. You could walk through into Narnia if you. So, and it had a padlock on it. He opened it up, and there inside of this chest, this closet, were all these tools hung in order, a row of chisels and some planes that were arranged in there, and hammers and every little tool that you would use in carpentry, and they're in immaculate order, and they were all clean. And he said, these are my tools. And he said, you don't use my tools. And he pulled a chisel down from the rack, and he said, I keep them very sharp. And he just took it on his arm and just slid it down his arm, and the hair just went falling like he was shaving with a Gillette. It was so sharp. And he said, the boys, that they don't keep them sharp like that. He said, you'll find gouges in them because they'll use it for a screwdriver when they shouldn't. And he said, so these are mine. These are set aside for my use, for my hands. And then he shut the thing back up. And see, they were sanctified. They stood in special relation to the hand of the master. And that was all the master's doing. It wasn't that those chisels were, they were responsible to keep themselves sharp. No, it was all of the master's hand. So sanctified speaks of a relationship that comes down from the throne, that is God's idea. It's not based on actions, actually. It's interesting in the rival cartels that and I know this is true because I've seen it on television, in the rival cartels they would often have people who maybe had family in both rivals or very intimate relationships that tied them in both directions, and they would designate, out of common accord, they would designate these people as untouchables because, and they enjoyed this special status of however the wars went between these opposing groups. These were supposed to carry special privilege and never become targets. That's sanctification. So sanctification, though, has to lead us towards perfection. It has to lead us towards a full growth. That what we read up there. I'm going to read this again. According to the New Testament teaching, a man is perfected when he has all his capabilities and possibilities of progress and goodness and communion with God made into realities and facts in his life. When the bud has flowered and the flower has fruited, when capacity is developed, privileges enjoyed, duties attended to, relationships entered into and maintained, when these things have taken place, the man is perfect. Sanctification is to lead us, open the door for, and illuminate the path of perfection. We have to have that relationship first. And then as we go on to embrace the path that God sets before us, it's to bring out and to highlight and to manifest all those virtues of those things that I just read. And if it doesn't take us there, there's something wrong with our sanctification. David's men, again, are one of the great examples here. They came to him, they were bitter, just a miserable lot, bitter, in debt, angry, fighting with each other, couldn't get along with anybody, disowned, cast out, miserable. But by living with the sanctified one, David, the man set aside with a special purpose, the virtues began to come forth in them. So that at the end of their wilderness pilgrimage and running around like gangsters being hunted down, they end up becoming the very administration of David's government because those virtues had come forth. They became perfect. They grew up. And the sanctification, imagine having a stream that the waters are contaminated, polluted, and but there is a solution to it. And in order to purify those waters, again, you must go up to the headwaters, find the headwaters, and cast in some special solution that will work its way all the way down to the stream, all the way to the mouth, and it will purify all those waters. But it has to be administered at the head of the stream. And when God's Holy Spirit does His sanctifying work in us, it's just it may take a while, but it will flow down through the whole stream and purify the whole thing. And I just want one more part there. It says, for in Hebrews 10:14 again, for by a single offering He has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So the are being there, it's how does that our being happens? I believe it happens. It's in one sense it's a done deal, but it takes us a while sometimes to catch on to it. And I believe that the work of the Holy Spirit in this situation, in this sanctification, taking us on to perfection, is that of wooing us to embrace the footstool. We don't just become the footstool. We cannot become the footstool kicking and screaming. You won't be dragged into it. It's a wooing. And this gentle process He takes us through, where every time after we've gone through some resistance and tried to preserve our own way, and finally we give in to Him and embrace fully from the heart what the humility He desired to implant through this experience, through this situation in our hearts, and we embrace that humility. You're embracing the footstool, and every time that happens, you grow. Every time you get low enough to embrace the footstool, you grow. One of the biggest obstacles in this are my ideas about how to be humble. And we so often we become real veterans, and we know what God's after, and so we learn the program, and the temptation to try to tweak things a little bit in our direction very subtly is oftentimes so great. It doesn't take much. But in order to just make things a little more endurable, just make things a little less humiliating. If we can just preserve a little bit of what we esteem about ourselves, we try to pull it off. But any ideas that we have about how to be a good footstool will not work. They will not work. No impressions of footstools allowed. It's either his embracing fully his level of footstool, because any level that you and I would dream up always leave Jesus with his feet higher than his head. If we try to supply our ideas of a great footstool, it always leaves him with his feet above his head. So this kingdom that we're headed toward, and we're going to look into more next time, the way it's extended and so on, it only can really find its effectiveness as we're willing to do it his way. And we all know that. I mean, you guys, most of you out there are veterans, and yet sometimes we need to be reminded. We need to be reminded that it's his way or not at all. So we'll leave it at this for this time. Bless you guys. Appreciate you.